Well, good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. We are continuing in our series that we've been doing on Wednesday nights of mining the minor prophets. And tonight we're going to begin looking at the book of Nahum. When we look at Nahum chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "The burden against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite." Now, Nahum's name means comfort, and although his prophecy has a lot to do with judgment, that judgment is against an enemy of Israel, and so it is going to be a comfort to God's people. Now, we don't know really too much about this prophet named Nahum. We're not really sure what an Elkoshite is. Whether that's talking about where he was born or where he had moved to. We're not sure really where this village is. The village, some people speculate that it was a village in southern Judah. Some believe that perhaps it was the city of Capernaum, because Capernaum means village of Nahum. And others speculate that it is connected with a city in northern Iraq called Al-Kosh. So if that was true, it would make Nahum a descendant of the Jews that were dispersed during the captivity of the Assyrian Empire. What we do know is that Nahum prophesied somewhere around 650 to 625 BC. And we see here that the burden is given against Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. And we need to review the Assyrian Empire a little bit here. The Assyrian Empire began as a city-state called Ashur back in about the 1300s BC, and it began to rise in regional prominence and start to capture many of the city-states around it, and it began to grow and grow until eventually it took over most of what is modern-day Iraq and Iran. As you see this map here, you can see the Assyrian Empire and Nineveh, its capital, up here toward the north. Now, Assyria was considered by historians the first true empire of the world, and it eventually grew to include parts of Iran over on this side and part of Turkey to the north, and it had captured all the way down into Egypt to the south. And so if you look at it in modern day pictures, you can see there mainly Syria and Iraq were the regions that it controlled during the height of its empire. Now, as we study Bible history, what we realize is that Assyria took the northern kingdom of Israel into captivity in about 722 BC. The northern kingdom had nothing but wicked kings, and God sent prophet after prophet after prophet warning them, and finally God allowed the Assyrians to come into Samaria, surround it, besiege it, and take the people captive. And as was the method of the Assyrians, when they captured a city or a country, they would take and displace the men and scatter them to other parts of their empire so that they would kind of lose their national identity and national loyalty. But what we see is that God also protected the southern kingdom of Judah from the attacks of the Assyrians under King Hezekiah. Sennacherib was the Assyrian general and king, and we see that God intervened on their behalf, and we find those stories in the Old Testament. The Assyrian Empire was especially known for its cruelty and violence and torture that it brought upon people. They ruled their empire by fear. They were known for impaling people and for filleting them alive. And this was done to try to keep people in submission and in control. But we see that they also were known as people that they were known for their innovation. They were known for their administration throughout their empire. And they were known for building infrastructure. Their royal roads led to many places throughout their empire. The highlight of the Assyrian Empire, of course, was their capital city of Nineveh. Nineveh was on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, opposite of what is present-day Mosul, Iraq. If you see this picture here, kind of depicts the beauty and the glory that Nineveh had. It was a very marvelous city for that time period of history. It had around it a huge wall, tall walls, with towers in it from place to place. Some of the towers as much as 100 feet tall, so they could see, excuse me, see any enemy that was coming. They had this wall was some wide enough for 3 chariots to ride around on, side by side. It had 15 gates around the city, and had a moat all the way around it that was 150 feet wide and 60 feet deep. The area of the city was about 1,800 acres. It was 7.5 miles around the circumference of this city. It was known for its vast library. King of Assyria gathered together over 30,000 volumes of his day. And remember, most of those volumes were on clay tablets at that time. They had a very large botanical parks as well as zoological parks. And so very sophisticated, very high-end, but very wicked, very much into idolatry. We know from the scriptures and from the minor prophets even that Jonah preached to them about a century before Nahum comes on the scene. And we see that there was a revival during the time of Noah, that the city repented and turned to Jehovah God. But now, when Nahum comes to preach his judgment against the people of Nineveh, we see that they've returned to their idolatry, they've returned to their violence, and they have gained an arrogance because they are the leaders of the known world at that time. John Phillips, as you saw on the title screen there, he entitled Nahum as Goodbye Nineveh. And this message that Nahum brings about the judgment and destruction that's going to take place on Nineveh probably made him the most popular prophet around, because everybody hated the oppression, the violence of the people of Assyria. So as we look at this first chapter here in the book of Nahum, the first thing we see is the declaration of Nineveh's doom in chapter 1. Verses 2 and 3, as we continue on, shows us the Lord's patience that he has had. It says, God is jealous, and the Lord avenges. The Lord avenges and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. We see here that Assyria had been used by God to punish the northern kingdom because of their sin, but their violence and idolatry has now infuriated God. They continued in their ruthless campaign to the southern kingdom of Judah, but realize this is God's land, this is God's people. God says here that he is slow to anger, but there is an end. There comes a time of accounting. And we see that accounting has come to pass. God waits and God warns. But understand that God does act. His timing isn't always our timing. When we see oppression or violence or evil in the world, we want God to act right now. But God has grander purposes in allowing the things that He allows. But understand that God will make all things right. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Think of back at the beginning of the Jews, when God brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees and brought him to what we call the promised land. That promise was made to Abraham, that this land would be his. But Abraham really never secured the land. He owned some parcels here and there, but it wasn't until 400 years later that they actually occupied the land. And what we see is that the Lord told Abraham that they weren't going to inherit the land yet, because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. God had patience with the Amorites, sent them message, sent them prophets, but they did not turn unto God, and eventually God has them destroyed and run out of the land of Israel. So here we see that we don't want to mistake God's patience with inaction. God's timing is not our timing, but Nineveh's time has come, and so we see God sends His prophet with the message of doom. Notice next in the latter part of verse 3 down through verse 5, here it talks about the Lord's power. It says at the end of verse 3, the Lord has His way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of His feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry, and dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the flower of Lebanon wilts. The mountains quake before Him, the hills melt, and the earth heaves at His presence. Yes, the world and all who dwell in it. We see that God's power is demonstrated in what the world likes to call as the forces of nature. It refers here to tornadoes and thunderstorms and earthquakes and volcanoes and floods and drought. These are all at God's disposal, and God uses them to remind nations of the world of their limitations. That God is the one that is ultimately in control. And no matter how powerful a nation may become, we see that God can even use a little thing like a virus, which is microscopic, we can't even see it, to bring nations to their knees. He mentions here Carmel and Bashan and Lebanon. These would have been the boundaries of the east and the west and the north of Israel. These areas were known for their fertility, yet God could bring them to their knees through drought or flood or whatever it may be. And each of these had seen the power of God placed upon them. Next, in verses 6 through 8, we see the Lord's presence is mentioned. It says, verse 6, who can stand before His indignation? And who can endure the fierceness of His anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by Him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and He knows those who trust Him. But with an overflowing flood, He will make an utter end of its place, and darkness will pursue His enemies. We see here that God will be like a consuming fire to His enemies. I don't know about you, but to me, one of the most fearful things would be to be caught in a raging fire. And this is the picture that is given of God in His anger and wrath, and pouring that out in fury against His enemies. But we see that in the midst of all of that wrath, God has mercy, and He has mercy upon His own people. He says here that He is a stronghold to those that trust in Him. He is ever present with them for protection. That stronghold may be referring to what Nineveh thought it had in all the great walls and the moat that it had to protect it. Yet there's no protection against a almighty God. But when God is on your side, my, what a stronghold you have when you have the presence of God. He mentions there an overflowing flood. And that may refer to symbolically the flooding of the armies of Babylon and the Medes that came and destroyed Nineveh. But it could also be referring to one of those, quote, forces of nature that God allowed when the Babylonians were attacking, that the river, the Tigris River that Nineveh was built alongside of, and one of its tributaries, the Kasha River that flowed right through Nineveh, they flooded and tore down part of the walls and allowed the Babylonians entrance into Nineveh and winning the Battle of Nineveh that took place in 612 BC. And notice the downfall of the Assyrians is mentioned as an utter end that came to them. Now, notice in verse 9 through 14 that God here reveals his purposes. Verse 9 says, "What do you conspire against the Lord? He will make an utter end of it. Affliction will not rise up a second time, for while tangled like thorns and while drunken like drunkards, they shall be devoured like stubble fully dried. From you comes forth one who plots evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor." He said there again, he will make an utter end of the Assyrians. It's repeating what he said in verse 9. God had seen all of their atrocities and he has had enough. But the reason was their vain and boastful attitude that they had toward Jehovah God. It said there at the beginning, what do you conspire against the Lord? Who do you think you are? You think you're making plans against God? When they were planning to try to go back and take Judah again, they had failed the first time because God miraculously intervened. And they were making plans again. Judah and Jerusalem in particular was a sore spot in them because they weren't able to conquer it the first time. But God made this known of his purposes. Affliction will not rise up a second time. You're not going to have a second chance to attack God's people there in Jerusalem. He says that they are like tangled like thorns and they are like drunkards. And that symbolizes the confusion that came to them as they came under attack by the Medes and the Babylonians and were destroyed. But verses 12 and 13 shows us a promise made to Judah. It says, "Thus says the Lord, though they are safe and likewise many, yet in this manner they will be cut down when he passes through. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. For now I will break off his yoke from you and burst your bonds apart." Now understand that God had used the Assyrians to afflict Judah in several ways. Sennacherib had come and attacked Jerusalem and Judah in about 701 BC. Judah had been paying tribute to Assyria during much of the reign of King Manasseh. And Judah's King Manasseh was also taken captive by the Assyrians for a while. You read back in the 2 Chronicles chapter 33. But that Assyrian oppression, like a yoke on an animal's neck, was going to be broken when Nineveh falls. Notice verse 14. It says, "The Lord has given a command concerning you. Your name shall be perpetuated no longer. Out of the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and the molded image. I will dig your grave, for you are vile." Many times Nineveh had desecrated the altars and temples of all the peoples that they had defeated. Her temple was lined with all of the gods that they had captured through all of their exploits. They had carried off their images and their idols, and Assyria thought this meant that her gods were superior to the gods of all the people that they had conquered. As a matter of fact, when Sennacherib was taunting the people of Jerusalem and yelling to them to surrender, they said, "Who do you think your God is? Look at all the other gods of all the other countries. Were their gods strong enough to protect them?" But we see that now Nineveh would experience the same fate it had placed on others, because they had come up against the true God, Jehovah God, and He would bring about their defeat. And then lastly, in the last verse, notice it says in verse 15, "Behold on the mountains the feet of him who brings good tidings, who proclaims peace. O Judah, keep your appointed feast, perform your vows, for the wicked one shall no more pass through you. He is utterly cut off." There again, the third time we see that utter destruction being mentioned of Nineveh. Here we see that God is telling Judah to be encouraged because they're going to be able to worship God in peace. They're not going to have to worry about the attack of the Assyrians, because God is going to utterly cut them off and destroy them. So they'll be able to worship God in peace. Now, we realize from history that Nineveh was so utterly destroyed that within 100 or 200 years, people even forgot where the city was. When Alexander the Great swooped through there, he didn't even realize that he was near what had been one of the greatest cities of antiquity. And Nineveh was so leveled and so destroyed that it was not rediscovered until as late as 1846 AD, thousands of years later. The lesson: don't mess with God. Don't mess with God's people. Those that oppose Him will face the destruction known in the future here. Those that oppose God will face the destruction that we call the Great Tribulation. And Jesus Christ will win the battle of Armageddon against all the nations that have opposed Him. You know, I'm thankful that I know that I'm on the winning side of that battle. God protects and defends His own. And so Nahum here, a prophet of God, gives a message of comfort. That message was, goodbye, Nineveh. You've gone too far, and God is going to utterly destroy you. And so even though it was a message pointed at Nineveh, it was also a message of comfort to God's people, the people of Judah, that they are going to soon be able to worship in peace because God is still on His throne. Well, thank you for joining us. We trust that the Lord is giving you a great week, that you'll stay focused upon Him, be in His Word, be in prayer, and be strengthened in His might. God bless you. Have a good night.